Psychology in the Indian tradition is the study of the person. The person is conceived as a unique composite of body, mind, and consciousness. Body refers to the senses, the central nervous system, the brain, and other supporting physical structures. The mind is a cognitive instrument connected with the body at one end and consciousness at the other. Mind and body are both physical, though the mind, unlike the body, is subtle and therefore manifests certain non-local characteristics. Consciousness is irreducibly distinct from the body and the mind. It does not therefore interact with the mind or body. However, the mind, by its association with consciousness, manifests certain characteristics that physical things do not normally have. Even though the mind, by its association with consciousness, manifests certain characteristics that physical things do not normally have. Even though the mind is physical, like the body, it cannot be reduced to its physical constituents, unlike other body, gross body. Again, a body or any mix of physical things cannot create a mind. Mind is a unique evolute of Prakriti. Once formed, mind takes on special role in the person until it dissolves itself in a state of inexistence, and merges back in the primordial matter called in the Indian tradition Prakriti. As a composite of body, mind, and consciousness, the person functions at three different levels. In the area of knowing, for example, the person is capable of processing information sensorially. This may be considered the level of observation, which in the Indian tradition is referred to as Sravana. The second level is the level of understanding facilitated by the active participation of the mind. This level is called Manana. The third level is called Nididhyasana, which involves transcognitive knowing or realization, brought about by meditation and sometimes occurs spontaneously. A state of realization is different from observation and understanding in that it is transcognitive and transcends such dichotomies as subject and object, thought and action. In a state of realization, knowing and being blend into each other so that one becomes and does what he knows. This is where I go. A quote from Upanishad was given to you. This is exemplified in the Upanishadic statement, to know Brahman is to be Brahman. This is what I call an intentional state of inexistence of the mind. Intentional state of inexistence of the mind. The mind doesn't operate. Just the consciousness, the way it is reflected. Again, the person, as a composite of body, mind, and consciousness, may be studied from three different perspectives: physiological, psychological, and spiritual. From the physiological perspective, we seek to learn how bodily processes influence one's behavior and being. From the psychological side, we may study the person to understand how mental states affect bodily states and how the latter may influence the mind as well. A person may be studied also from the spiritual perspective to learn about transcognitive states and how consciousness is involved in our being, and to realize non-physical resources of human functioning. Different methods are needed to pursue these studies at different levels. However, in the Indian tradition, the approach itself is essentially holistic. Now, this is the broad outline of the model I'm trying to present to you, and it has tremendous implications in so many ways. First, let us consider the context. This is the context. the biocentric bias of contemporary psychology. The vain behaviorist attempts to banish consciousness and subjectivity from the presence of science and psychology. And then the attempts of cognitive psychology, its, in my view, inability to capture subjectivity within computational framework and reductionist paradigm. Consciousness, in the sense of subjective awareness, remains unexplained today. Artificial subjectivity and machine consciousness appear to be still unrealized goals. Significant scientific evidence suggests the possibility of awareness independent of sensory processes. The existence of states of pure consciousness or contentless, non-intentional consciousness suggested by claimed mystical experiences is a priori admissible from the biocentric cognitive models in current psychology. Freedom of will is greatly compromised in all forms of reductionist psychological models. There is thus, I think, an urgent need to enlarge the scope of psychology, which calls for a paradigmatic shift in thinking about human nature. Indian psychology can make a legitimate claim to offer a viable alternative to the limited biocentric model that underlies mainstream psychology. We have been trying for a while, a few of us, trying to develop a system of psychology that is based essentially on classical Indian thinking of the mind. I will discuss in some detail. I'm happy that Sangeeta Menon is here. He is one of the core group, starting about 10 years ago, who have been working together to develop this model. It doesn't mean what I'm saying is what Sangeeta is going to accept, but certainly it is how I interpret it. Now, people ask, what is Indian psychology? In fact, a couple of weeks ago, I was in a meeting of the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies. The chairman, Gopal Krishna Gandhi, when I raised the question, told them that we should support Indian psychology, have more fellows from Indian psychology background to be at the Indian Institute of Advanced Study. Well, he was surprised and said, what is Indian psychology? I can't understand. How can there be an Indian physics? How can there be an Indian chemistry? What is Indian psychology? It doesn't make any sense. So it's very difficult to understand what Indian psychology is, especially when you consider that Indian psychology, for the most part, is not what psychologists in India do. That makes it even more complicated. The question, what is Indian psychology, is often raised whenever we speak of Indian psychology. The stock answer I usually give is that Indian psychology is a system of psychology derived from classical Indian thought and rooted in such psychological relevant practices as yoga, prevalent in the Indian subcontinent for centuries. This statement often satisfies the inquiring minds in India. However, when I speak to my Western colleagues, it appears to leave an impression in their minds that Indian psychology is possibly no more than rehashing some old ideas and presenting philosophies of a bygone age in contemporary psychological idiom. This attitude is not very different from the way Indian philosophy was looked upon by Western psychology, Western philosophers and scholars for a long time as some kind of faith and dogma and not a rational discourse. We find this attitude expressed from the time of David Hume and John Locke, through Edmund Husserl to Anthony Flew. For Hume and Locke, Indian philosophy is a bunch of superstitions. Husserl saw no more in Eastern philosophies, including India, than fostering mystical religious attitude. Again, Flew, writing in 1971, said there is no philosophy east of Suez. As I reflect on this state of affairs, I come to realize increasingly that this kind of misunderstanding of Indian intellectual tradition stems from the way philosophy is done in India from its very beginning, 3,000 years ago. First, ideas are seen in the Indian tradition as having their origin in intuitions, which are later rationally elaborated and interpreted. Second, ideas are taken as transpersonal and not belonging to or owned by one or more persons. For this reason, Vedas are considered apaurusheyas, which means they are revealed and not authored. Indian history has very scant references to persons and dates. They are not considered important in the history of ideas. Indian thought, it seems to me, is a kind of heuristic hermeneutics, creative interpretation of intuitive insights. It all began with Vedic saints and Upanishadic seers who recorded their intuitive insights, which were codified and systematized during the Sutra period and were elaborated by successive commentators. No claim of originality was made by any of these. They attributed all of this to the original source, Vedas and Upanishads, in the case of Hindu systems, and to the Buddha by the successive Buddhistic thinkers, and so on. It does not follow, however, that there is little that is original in the enormous literature flowing from the original sources. Shankara, for example, is as much of an original thinker as Kant. But no such claim is made on his behalf because this is not consistent with the Indian tradition. There is much in Shankara's writings that is not in the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Brahma Sutras on which he commented. Yet, he considered his thought and ideas as stemming from his meditation on the original texts. At the same time, Shankara's writings are full of rational arguments accompanied by impeccable logic, but they are subordinated to the intuitively revealed truth. To deny philosophical merit to a system like Advaita is to misconstrue creativity and originality. Ideas in Indian tradition cannot be intuitive, cannot be invented. Ideas in the Indian tradition cannot be invented. They are there to be discovered. Reason and logic help us to uncover and understand them, but they do not create new ideas. Direct, true access to ideas is through intuition. This is a significant point in Indian epistemology. Even those of us who teach Indian epistemology do not quite often appreciate this fact. Now, applying this to Indian psychology, we could say that Indian psychology is to Indian thought what Advaita is to the Upanishads. And therefore, what some of us have written about Indian psychology is our creative interpretation of the psychological insights in classical Indian thought. It would be futile to argue whether we have faithfully interpreted them or not. Rather, the effort to build a system of Indian psychology should be judged on the relevance of these ideas as developed and interpreted in the context of current psychological discourse. What follows, therefore, is a heuristic hermeneutic exercise to creatively interpret classical Indian psychological ideas as constituting a coherent system with important implications for psychological study and research. I hope this helps you to see where I'm coming from. The conceptual building blocks of the Indian psychological edifice are consciousness, person, mind, and freedom. Consciousness is the central concept. The person is the subject of focus. The mind is the main instrument of study, and freedom of the person is the goal to be achieved. The conceptual building blocks of the Indian psychological edifice, the principles of Indian psychology, may be stated briefly in the following aphorisms. I did a book a year ago. It's called Cognitive Anomalies, Consciousness and Yoga. And in this, I have summarized 333 such principles. I call them Jivasastra Sutra. Jivasastra is psychology of the person. And I do not know whether you have a book exhibition associated with this conference. I asked my publisher to have some copies here. I don't know. There is an exhibition here in Vietnam. But I also asked him if any of the people who are attending this conference are interested in buying the book, to give them a discount of 40%. And therefore, if you mention that you have attended this conference and this lecture and write to him, he will give you a 40% discount. And this more or less states what I'm going to speak. And again, in the introduction, Mr. Sriramurthy had mentioned about my book on Gandhi and applied spirituality, where I try to apply the principles of Indian psychology to study and interpret Gandhiji. Again, this book is published by the same publisher. He would give you, if you say that you have attended my lecture, 40% discount. And you can get the address of the publisher here. The principles of Indian psychology may be stated briefly in the following aphorisms. As I said, there were 333 when I wrote this book. And if I redo them, they will be close to 500. But what you have here is only about 26, because I will not have time to go through all of them. Psychology is consciousness embodied. And this might lead to some confusion when I say consciousness embodied. Embodied consciousness is not a compound, but a composite of consciousness and body. The result is not an amalgamation of the two, because there is no interaction between them. But what we have is a reflection of consciousness in the body. The body extends from being extremely subtle at one end to an entirely gross at the other end. The extremely subtle body is a special evolute of Prakriti, and that is the mind. Prakriti, of course, is the foundational source of all forms of matter. In other words, mind is material. Mind is physical in the Indian tradition. In the existential context, therefore, the person is a unique composite of body, mind, and consciousness. Embodied, consciousness becomes conditioned. Conditioned, consciousness loses its spontaneity and freedom and is therefore embellished. Embellished, consciousness manifests in human condition in a variety of states, forms, and modes. With consciousness manifesting in sensory modes, the person is dragged into the net of samsara. The net of samsara is woven with the thought fiber of the mind. The mind is the instrument of one's thought, passion, and action. With the mind in place, the person is the doer, knower, and enjoyer. Conditioned, the person is driven by the mind. Unconditioned, the person drives the mind. The prime manifestation of the conditioned mind is the ego. The defining characteristic of the ego is individuation, which gives the person her identity and the experience of self-sameness. The ego's essential qualities are attachment, binding, and biasing the person, our perceptions, attitudes, and aspirations. Attachment generates desires. Binding prompts clinging, and biasing distorts truth and results in ignorance. Ignorance is not lack of knowledge. Ignorance is wrong knowledge. Desires cause action. Clinging engenders passion and feeling, and ignorance leads to obsession. The conditioned mind thus limits, obscures, veils, and distorts consciousness. With the result, truth gets clouded, and knowing becomes fallible, behavior imperfect, and feelings biased and strained. The person trapped thus in the net spread by the mind suffocates and suffers the pain of existence. Such is the human predicament, a congenital state of conditioned existence and consequent loss of freedom and manifestation of perpetual misery, pain, and suffering. You find this all through Hindu as well as Buddhistic and other Indian systems. The existential question is therefore to escape from the net of samsara, overcome the predicament of suffering, and achieve the freedom of the person. The path is one of dismantling the conditioned thoughts and emptying the mind of its contents that empower and fuel the desires and passions. In other words, the remedy for suffering consists in disabling or dissolving the net of samsara. There are, of course, built-in hurdles that obstruct the person from dismantling the net. These include ignorance, ego, and the past life patterns, the habits formed, the impressions created, and the complex dispositions stored up at the subliminal level, often called as samskaras. Overcoming of the hurdles is facilitated by enlightenment, ego deconditioning, ethical conduct, and altruistic actions. Enlightenment is more than cognitive understanding. It involves a higher state of realization. In a state of realization, there is no gap between belief and behavior, cognition and conduct, knowing and being. Deconstruction of the ego involves cultivating the habits of detachment and deconditioning the mind from past obsessive thoughts, feelings, and dispositions. Enlightenment, overcoming of the hurdles is facilitated by enlightenment, ego conditioning, and ethical. This I think I said. Enlightenment is more than cognitive understanding. It involves higher state of realization. In a state of realization, there is no gap between belief and behavior. I think I'm redoing it. The hurdles and obstructions may be overcome by practice of meditation. And meditation becomes in a variety of forms and leads the person on a path toward freedom from ego compulsions. It liberates the person from the constraints of the past and enables her to reach a state of realization. On the path of realization and in the process of deconstructing of the mind and the ego, a variety of phenomena of psychological significance and interest manifest, and new human potentials unfold. With the ego transcendence, practice of detachment and emptying of dispositions and desires come universal love and compassion, followed by altruistic actions. In a state of realization, the person is free from all past conditionings, and consequent suffering. It is a state of perfection. Self-realized person is the enlightened one who comes face to face to know the truth and reflects it in her being. I believe the above general principles are equally applicable to heterodox systems like Buddhism and Jainism as they do to yoga and Vedanta and other classical Hindu systems. Utilizing the same principles, each of the Indian thought systems advanced Indian psychology by specializing in some areas and making significant contributions to them. Buddhism has excelled in analyzing consciousness and has given us a pervasive phenomenology of consciousness. Since this conference is on the science of consciousness, I would like to spend some time in explaining the Buddhistic ideas on consciousness. Now, in Buddhistic thinking, consciousness manifests at 4 different levels, 4 planes, 4 worlds. Buddhists describe consciousness as belonging to 4 different realms, depending on the state of the person in his psychological or psychophysical development. They are the empirical world, known through the senses and driven by desire, is called the Kamaloka. The meditative world with Rupa. The meditative world without form, without Rupa. And finally, the world of transcendence, Lokottara. These are the 4 planes of consciousness. As you can see, each one of them is again further divided. There are 54 different kinds of states of consciousness in the empirical world. There are 15 in the sublime with form, and 12 in sublime without form. And then there are 8 in the Lokottara state. This could be, by some systems, extended to 40 by multiplying by 5 different kinds. This division is very similar to the 4-fold division found in the Upanishads and elaborated in Advaita. The difference between the two consists in that the single state of Turiya, state in Samadhi, the Samadhi state of consciousness in Advaita is divided into 3 separate states in Buddhism. And the empirical consciousness of Kamaloka appears as 3 different states of waking, dream, and dreamless sleep in Vedanta. Now these are the 4: waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and transcendental or Turiya state. In addition to the 4 planes mentioned above, there appear to be 2 other distinct principles employed by Buddhist scholars in the classification of states of consciousness. One principle refers to the ethical nature of the thoughts. The second relates to the underlying sources of motivation. This is very important to keep in perspective because the whole business of psychology is change the person. So we understand the person in order to change him, to make him better, and to get rid of the suffering in which we are situated currently. And therefore, karma, which is the binding force that drives our behavior, has to be dealt with. And therefore, motivation becomes very important. Karma arises only in volitional acts. And where no volition is involved, there is very little karma. Either the past karma is playing out, or something is happening which has no consequence. But wherever karma is involved, it means that it is due to your motivation. And therefore, ethical and motivational behavior is very important. Now this is the classification: moral, immoral, indifferent, ineffective, and again resultant and inoperative, and again the resultant with roots and without roots. I don't have time to go into details. And again, you can see the differences: the motivated and unmotivated, attachment, detachment, prejudice, unbiased, delusional, and non-delusional. Now, let me describe in a little more detail about the forms of consciousness in Kamaloka. The empirical is the world common to all humans. As mentioned, Buddhism distinguishes between 54 forms of consciousness in the empirical world. This is the world operated by the senses, cognitively known and driven by desire by and large. Sensory awareness constitutes the objective aspect, and the accompanying desires and the cravings are the subjective aspect of a given thought in the empirical domain. Kamaloka forms are divided into 8 moral states, 12 immoral states, and 34 morally indifferent states. The indifferent states are further classified into 11 inoperative states and 23 resultant states. Some of these states are with roots and others are without roots. It is possible for humans to achieve higher states of consciousness beyond the sense-mediated and mind-processed cognitions by disciplined training of the mind, accompanied by ethical living, followed by right knowledge, wisdom. The mind is normally hindered in its functioning by 5 factors, very similar to what I have been talking about earlier. These hindrances are desires, hatred, indolence, restlessness, and doubt. These need to be overcome in order to achieve the higher states of consciousness. Meditation coupled with moral habits helps to suppress and overcome the hindrances. Buddhists trace 5 steps in the progress of meditation. They are called vitakka, discursive and relational thought, also labeled as initial application, vichara, inquiry, also called continued application, piti, thrill and enjoyable interest, sukha, psychological state of ease, comfort and equanimity, and finally ekagata or ekagrata, concentration. In the Theravada tradition, there are basically three higher states of consciousness. One is said to belong to the world of rupa, and another to the world without form, arupa. The third is an altogether different state beyond these worlds, lokottara, belonging to a different realm of being altogether. Consciousness in the lokottara realm appears to be qualitatively different from the rest. It is a state Buddha seemed to have attained, and it is the goal of all aspirants of nirvana. These three levels appear to be analogous, as I mentioned, to samprajnata, asamprajnata, and kaivalya states in yoga psychology. We do not find Buddhistic thinkers making any clear-cut distinction between mind and consciousness, as is the case I explained a little while ago in Western psychological thought. But this, in Buddhism, is confined to Kamaloka, empirical world, but then there are other worlds beyond the empirical. Also, contentless or non-intentional consciousness in this domain appears to be an absurdity in the empirical domain from Buddhists. Here the mind rules and consciousness follows. However, at the rupa and arupa planes, we find the distinction between consciousness and the mind making its way. The mind in these lokas is trained in a state of samadhi, is restrained in a state of samadhi, and consciousness takes an altogether different form. In the lokottara plane, the mind is not merely restrained, it is completely annihilated. This I call it the state of inexistence. This happens when one achieves nirvana, or perhaps higher levels of samadhi, with consciousness manifesting in its most sublime form. Because mind reduced to nothing, mind just reflects consciousness the way it really is. Therefore, you find in the Yoga Sutras say, buddhi, purified buddhi, unaffected by the others, purified sattva in the buddhi, unaffected by the others, is almost like consciousness, almost like Purusha. Once all these defects are removed, and the mind in its purity, buddhi as pure sattva, is indistinguishable from Purusha. That is, when your mind reaches a state of inexistence, then you have consciousness experienced, realized in one speed. Buddhism not only provides a highly developed conceptual framework for the science of consciousness, but it also deals with practical methods to develop these states and for studying them. I believe Buddhist texts and practices contain the architectonic and a blueprint for erecting a comprehensive edifice of the science of consciousness. I'll try to close up. Humans are capable of sense-driven learning, intellect-guided understanding, and intuitive realization. In Indian tradition, these are identified, as I mentioned a little while earlier, Shravana, Manana, and Nididhyasana. Shravana literally means hearing, which during the post-Vedic period meant hearing the truth from the teachers trusted for their Vedic knowledge. May be interpreted now as sensory processed information such as perceptual knowing or learning by reading or other sources of communication. It involves the brain-driven processes accessible to third-person observation. Manana, reasoning, gives mind-constructed cognitions which are first-person experiences that can be shared with others and therefore permit second-person mediation. Subjective experience in the Indian tradition is not pseudo-experience. It is real, valid, and relevant for the psychological understanding of the person. Nididhyasana, meditative knowing, results in an entirely experiential transcognitive state. It gives intuitive insights, which are believed to be utterly subjective and ineffable. They can be neither introspectively observed nor shared with others through second-person mediation. Nididhyasana involves more than knowing. it affects being itself. Nididhyasana is the first order knowing. Its truth is self-certifying. Its validity may be seen by its effects on the person. Those engaged in nididhyasana, it is assumed, tend to move progressively closer to perfection in thought, passion, and action. Manana is knowledge of the second order. Its truth is rationally apprehended and logically attested. Shravana is knowledge of the third order. It can be objectively recorded and verified. Psychological knowledge at the level of Shravana may be obtained through observation, experiment, and physical measurement. It is possible. At the level of Manana, introspective narratives and second-person techniques can be employed as psychological tools. With Nididhyasana, knowing becomes being. It's not knowledge, it's a transformation of the person or self. Therefore, by observing the effects, the transformational consequences of the person who is presumed to be in that particular state, non-ordinary states of transcendence can be studied. This is the indirect method of observation as distinguished from the other two, which permit some kind of direct knowing. Thus, all of Indian psychology is observational, and some of it permits experimental exploration. There is, however, a crucial difference between Western and Indian notions of observation. In the Indian tradition, to experience is also to observe. To experience is also to observe. Whereas in the Western tradition, to observe is to be objective and public, and to experience is to be subjective and private. Psychology in Indian tradition is a science in the wider and inclusive sense. However, it is not a science in the sense of physics. In the sense of physics is a science, because consciousness is not physical. Psychology is more than a biological science. It is primarily a human science, a fact often ignored in contemporary psychological discourse. In contrast to the biocentric bias of Western psychology, to which I referred in the very beginning, Indian psychology has consciousness as its core concept. Centrality of consciousness is its defining characteristic. Consciousness is assumed to be irreducible, in principle, to brain states. The brain does not generate consciousness. It simply reflects consciousness. And often, these reflections are distorted, limited, and embellished. And I hope I have given you a glimpse of Indian psychology. And we are hoping to develop a system of Indian psychology, which would be like, I wouldn't say it would replace all psychology, it would be like behaviorism or psychoanalysis, an alternate model that accommodates not only the physical, but also the spiritual, not only the mental, but also the sublime. And this, I think, is a tragedy of contemporary psychological thinking that limits human nature to only that which is physically observable and recorded by instrumentation. And therefore, we have reduced human nature and human behavior to the so-called physiological or biological level. And I think unless we transcend that, able to deal directly with the person who is a manifestation of the reflections of consciousness in our mind and body, we will never be able to fully grasp and understand who we are, where our destiny lies, and how we can reach it. Thank you.